Welcome to Clued in Mystery. I'm Sarah.
And I'm Brooke, and we both love mystery.
Hi, Brooke.
Hi, Sarah. We have such a special day today.
I know. I am so excited.
Today, we are interviewing Eve Lazarus. So I will begin by reading Eve's bio and introduce all of you to her. Eve Lazarus is a reporter and author, and she hosts and produces the Cold Case Canada True Crime podcast. About 20 years ago, a series of events led to her first book, At Home with History, and the idea that a house has a social history and comes alive through the people who lived inside its walls. Sensational Victoria and Sensational Vancouver continued the theme, adding stories about bootleggers and brothels, corrupt cops, and murder. By the time she wrote Cold Case Vancouver, Eve realized that she was writing historical true crime. Blood, Sweat, and Fear tells the story of Inspector J.F.C.B. Vance, Vancouver's first forensic investigator, and Murder by Milkshake tells the story of Esther Castanelli's arsenic death in 1965 by her husband Renee, a CKNW radio personality. Her most recent book, Cold Case BC, The Stories Behind the Province's Most Intriguing Murder and Missing Person Cases, has been on the BC bestsellers list for the last 12 weeks, 10 of those at number 1. Welcome, Eve. We're so honored to have you join us today.
Oh, I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, so Eve, I'm very excited to be speaking to you because I'm also in Vancouver and have read many of your books. And so it'll be so great to have this conversation about true crime with you. So Brooke and I have talked a little bit about true crime on a previous episode. And one of the things that I wanted to hear from you was about how with fiction, an author has the freedom to invent, but with true crime, there's really no room for that invention. How do you tell a story when you don't have access to the people and you need to focus on the facts?
Good question. Obviously, I don't have access to the victims, but I do have access to their friends and their family. And that's even in cases that are 70 years old. And that was really my first one. And it's probably the best way to explain that is to give you an example, if that's okay. In my book, Cold Case Vancouver, came out in 2015, and I wrote about Jenny Conroy. She was a 24-year-old North Vancouver war worker, and she was murdered in 1944. And I'd almost finished the book, and I got a call one day from the archivist at the North Vancouver Museum and Archives, who I spent a lot of time down there, so I knew her quite well, and she knew what I was doing. And she called me up and she said that they'd just come into the possession of this photo album, and it had pictures of the Conroy family from around 1900 to up to the early 1940s. And inscribed in the album cover was the name Jenny Conroy. And Diane, the archivist, had done some research, and she found out that Jenny had been murdered and her case was never solved. And, I thought, oh, my God, I've just finished this book, too bad I can't include it, blah, blah. So I wrote up a story on my blog, and I put, a couple of photos from the photo album and took a photo of Diane holding the album and just, sent that out to the world. And the next day, I got this note from Jenny's niece. And she'd been born, years after her aunt died, and it was kind of a family secret that she'd just, pretty stumbled over. She'd seen a photo of this woman and asked her father who it was, and she said, he told her it was her aunt that had been murdered, and didn't really want to talk about it. And it turned out that Jenny was an unmarried mother, and she'd given her baby up for adoption. And, back in the 40s, this was, quite a scandal. And when the press, the police rather, had leaked this to the media, and the newspaper reports at the time was just horrendous. They basically blamed her for her own murder. And anyway, when Mary, her adopted daughter, had gone looking for her biological family, back in, I guess, probably 25 years ago. And at that time, she'd done a bunch of research and she'd got hold of all her adoption records and things like that. And she'd been able to put together quite a story and connect with her family in Canada. She still does live in New Zealand. And Debbie had put me in touch with her, and it was so fascinating. I called up my editor and I said, wow, this is such a great story. I really want, to include this in the book. And she said, well, you've got a week. And, because most of these stories take months of writing and research. And in the end, Debbie and Mary and I kind of collaborated on this story, and it became the first chapter of my book. And I think probably the most powerful in there, having these voices that were there. And I was able to source all the original newspaper clippings. I had the Inquisition after her death, which, had a ton of information. And I got through a completely different source. I came across the crime scene photos, her autopsy photos, and at one point I even had her hair and gravel from the crime scene spilling out of these little envelopes onto my desk. It was quite intense.
Oh my goodness.
Does that kind of answer your question in a long, long roundabout way?
Wow. That must have just been a almost surreal experience.
Well, it was, and it got even really more bizarre because after I put the story together, I was starting to read the newspaper clippings about the investigation or lack of what it was into a murder. But they brought West Vancouver. She died in West Vancouver, and the police force had, were pretty decimated with the war. They, did a pretty lousy job, and they'd brought over Walter Mulligan, who was a detective with the Vancouver police, and also this guy called John Vance, and he was the forensic investigator. And when I read this in the clipping, I thought, oh my God, we had forensics back in, 1944. That's really cool. So I went to the Vancouver Police Museum and Archives and started to do a bit of research about him. Have you been to the building?
I have.
It's the Police Museum?
Yeah, it's a great. It's one of my favorite places in Vancouver.
Oh, it's amazing. It's kind of our best kept secret. It's so incredible. It still, as you know, has the morgue still intact. It's still got the autopsy suite and downstairs, which is not open to the public, was actually Vance's lab. And he founded the building in 1932 to do his forensics. And, it turned out this incredible story that he was one of the first forensic scientists in North America and, the first one connected to a police department. And then I got really obsessed with finding out more about Vance. I found his family, decided to do a book on him. And once I got to know some of the family, he died in 1964, right? So I got hold of some of his grandchildren that had met him and knew him when they were children. And one of them told me about these boxes that she'd helped him pack up back in, early 1960s. And she said, oh, yeah, there were all these crime scene photos and all this, incredible information. And, it's probably got thrown out decades ago. And I emailed everyone I knew from the Vance family. And I said, look, could everyone just check their attics and, their basements and just see if any of this information, still exists. And I got this call and they'd found this grandson who lived on Gabriola Island, found 7 boxes that were sealed. They'd been there in his garage for decades. And when we got them, we opened the first box. It was just like, winning the lottery for a researcher. It was so incredible because it was all his material. It was his case notes, his diary. It was, photos and just incredible information. And but we opened Janie, his granddaughter, and I opened the first box, and the envelope, this tattered envelope, and it's marked Jenny Conroy, murdered 1944. My Jenny, right, that I'd been researching. So I opened up, the envelope, and it turned out, obviously, it was one of the cases that had really stuck with him for all these years, and he'd taken it home with him when he'd retired, and and obviously never sold it, unfortunately. But all the forensic samples were there, and all these photos and some of the autopsy photos were just horrendous. But it was just so incredible to get this information.
That is incredible.
I'm just sitting here gobsmacked at how amazing that experience must have been, Eve. And I'm sitting here thinking, as a fiction author, this story would be such a great storyline. You were the detective. As the true crime author, you became a detective in putting this case together and meeting the people and gathering the clues. And it's amazing and wonderful. What a fun experience you must have had.
It really was. It was incredible working on that, and incredible finding out about this guy that had been essentially lost to history. And even the police museum didn't have all that much information on him. And so they were just thrilled. I was able to have the family donate, they sort of act as a broker, and the family donated all that material to the police museum where it's, been properly archived and put away. And they're planning an exhibit actually in the fall, which I'm really, really excited about.
Oh, I'm definitely going to check that out. How do you, when you're writing true crime, how do you avoid sensationalizing the crimes and remain sensitive to the families of the people who are involved in these events? And clearly you had an opportunity to, it sounds like, become quite close with some of these family members.
I work really, really closely with the families, and I get to know them quite well in some cases. And I'm always, I guess that's front of mind for me when I'm writing something, knowing that they're going to read it. I don't sensationalize the details. I think they're always sensational enough as they are, but I don't shy away from them either. I think people need to care about these cases, and I think by writing about them properly, not shying away from uncomfortable details, sort of helps them do that. I also, journalism 101, you're always told never show your source's story before it's published. And, I worked in newspapers for years and magazines and always held to that. But I changed that very quickly when I was writing books. I'm happy to share the interviews with the sources. And in some cases, especially in one chapter in the book where a 14-year-old girl went missing, still hasn't been found since 1993, so over 30 years. And I worked very closely with her mother and her sister, and we went over draft after draft. And all I think it did was, well, it certainly made them feel better, but it also strengthened the story. It made sure I had all the facts correct. Also spoke to the father, who'd never given an interview before in all this time, and he was a former RCMP officer. And so I had him on the record, and I spoke to the RCMP up in where she went missing, and they were quite candid with me, again, because I shared everything. And I did the same. I'm just doing a podcast, actually, about this case. It was Lindsay Nichols. She was a 14-year-old girl who went missing from Comox in 1993. And, again, I've, shared all the interview tapes with them as well. And so everyone's, feeling quite comfortable. So I guess that's how I do it. I'm just try to always remember that they're reading these cases. And another podcast I'm working on, the case that was in the book, is Gloria Moody. And it's one of the Highway of Tears cases. And she was brutally murdered in 1969 in Williams Lake while she was away on a weekend with her family. And she had a 4-year-old and a 3-year-old. And her 4-year-old daughter now is obviously grown up with children of her own. And so I worked very closely with her. But this is something that just destroyed the family, as you can imagine. And so, yeah, I'm really, really sensitive to that, and ran, all the interviews by Vanessa, and fortunately, she was quite happy to have them in. Because again, it's important for me it's not my story. I'm telling someone else's story. And it's really important for me to have their voices in there telling their own story. So I do spend a lot of time with that.
I imagine the work that you're doing, these stories really stay with you.
Oh, yeah.
True crime, like many of the subgenres in the mystery space, is currently very popular. And that might mean that the same story is being told by many researchers. If someone has previously covered an event that you're writing about, does that influence you or the way that you do your research or end up telling the story at the end?
Typically, I write about people who haven't been covered very much at all. They've just been forgotten. Their case happened decades ago, and it's just been forgotten by everybody except, their family and friends. And, the most recent case I covered was Lindsay Nichols in 1993. And, it goes right back to 1944, a 15-year-old girl who was murdered in Victoria. So again, some of them are well known, like the Babes in the Woods, I guess, would be probably the most well-known one. And in fact, I'd written about that in Cold Case Vancouver in 2015. And at the time, I've been obsessed by this case since, the late 80s when I first came to Canada, and went to the police museum and saw the exhibit. I should back up because people may not be obsessed with this case as much as I am. Are you familiar with the Babes in the Woods?
They're the bodies that were in Stanley Park?
Yeah. There were two little skeletons that were found in Stanley Park in 1953. And it's just, become sort of mythology about, Stanley Park being our kind of crown jewel, having these, two little skeletons buried there that no one missed or reported missing. And the case was just absolutely intriguing over the years, and I nearly didn't write about it in Cold Case Vancouver because I thought, everyone knows about the case. And when I went to look where it had been written about, there was barely anything done about it. And so I spent a huge amount of time researching that, going back to the early newspaper reports, going to the police museum, who, they had quite a bit of information. And at that time, in the late 80s, and I'm not even sure I was aware of this at the time, but they had the actual skulls of the children on display in the case. And when I found out about that later, that really, impacted me that could happen. And they actually went on display at the P&E, these actual children's skulls, which is just stunning to me. Anyway, I got completely obsessed with this story. It told the story in Cold Case Vancouver, just talking to police that had worked on the case over the years. I talked to the coroner. In fact, we became quite good friends. She's the identification specialist, and she's worked on the case for, probably a decade, trying to identify these kids. And so I spent a lot of time trying to also put it into the context of, the history, because the police have always thought that the mother had killed the children. And I found this, as a mother, quite horrific. But when I went to the police museum and started going through annual reports from 1947, 1948, when they thought the children were killed, I found 3 murder-suicides, 2 where the mother had gassed herself and her children, and another one where the mother had thrown her 2 children over a bridge and then jumped off after them. And times were really tough for women back then, and really, much worse for unmarried mothers. There was no social welfare net, and really poorly paid jobs in retail or domestic service were the only things that, most women could get, and that just didn't allow for women. So, it became I get this, the idea that a desperate single mother killed herself and her children kind of made a little more sense. And then just over, last February, they actually got enough DNA to put into the DNA databank in the States, and they got a hit. And they actually found the family members, and the kids were given their names back after, nearly 70 years, which is just absolutely amazing, through the magic of genetic genealogy, which is solving so many cases south of the border. And lucky for me, I found out through a couple of sources that they'd been identified, that couldn't get any more information out of anyone. They were keeping it very close to the vest. And then I just got a message from this young woman, and she'd told me that the police had been to see her mother, that they told her mother that her uncles had been identified, they'd been murdered, they were the babes in the woods. Can you imagine getting that visit? And anyway, they never heard of the babes in the woods, and they Googled them and came across my podcast that I'd done about them. And they actually told me the story. So I actually broke this story, which is definitely a highlight of my year last year. It doesn't happen very much when you're writing about history and true crime. You don't get to break many stories on cold cases. So this was quite exciting that we found out who they were connected to and who they were. The murder's still unsolved, but I think the important thing was that they're identified.
How do you feel about fiction stories that are based on real events? I'm thinking about the series, I think it was last year, out about Elizabeth Holmes. So it was called The Dropout, and it was actually based on a true crime podcast that had the same name. What's your take on fictionalizing a true event?
Well, I've got to tell you, I haven't seen The Dropout, so I can't talk to that. And it sounds bizarre, but I don't watch many documentaries or stories that are supposedly based on real events, because it actually does upset me. And although I am a true crime podcast junkie, that I don't tend to watch Dateline or true crime documentaries and things. And I've had actually one of my books, Blood, Sweat and Fear, that Inspector Vance, has just been optioned for a TV series this week. And another one, Murder by Milkshake, that you mentioned that in the introduction, the story about a radio personality who murdered his wife with arsenic milkshakes so he could marry the 20-something receptionist. Was optioned also for a TV and film a couple of years ago. And I think, as exciting as this is, and oh my God, it would just be incredible if they get made, or one of them does at least, I'll probably hate it because it will be based on my book. It won't be my book. It won't be, a documentary. It's probably going to be like The Dropout, I guess, without seeing it. Because, with Murder by Milkshake, for instance, they had an 11-year-old daughter named Janine, and when her dad murdered her mum with arsenic. And Janine had actually approached me, weirdly enough, at my book launch, which we held at the Vancouver Police Museum. So much of my stuff comes out of the Vancouver Police Museum. It's incredible. But Janine came to my book launch, and we'd set up a cash bar in the autopsy suite. And I was sitting, having a glass of wine, talking to people, standing behind, Esther Castellani, the woman that was murdered, true crime exhibit. And Janine came up and said, "Oh, hi, I'm Janine Castellani." And I thought, "Oh my God." That's incredible, because I'd written a blog about this story. This was before long before the book came out. I wrote this blog. And, lucky for me, I made a mistake. I'd said that Lolly, this was the mistress, the receptionist, had a 6-year-old daughter. And then I got this note and said, "Oh, no, you're wrong. Lolly had a son, my husband, Don. He's actually been looking for Janine for 50 years. Do you know where we could find her?" And I said, "Oh, no. I wish, because I'd love to talk to her. It's an amazing story." And then, this happened about a year later when Janine found me at the book launch. And I remember saying to her, I said, "Oh my God, do you know Don's been looking for you?" And she just broke down. She said, "Oh my God, I've been looking for him for nearly 50 years. And it turned out after her dad murdered her mother, the dad moved him and Janine in with the mistress and her son, if you can believe this. And months went by, he ended up getting convicted for capital murder, and Janine stayed with the mistress and Don. So they grew up for several years as brother and sister. And then he was in jail for murder. And I guess Lolly met a new man, and she dropped off Janine to another relative, like a stray dog. And she never saw Don again. So what was incredibly exciting for me is I actually brought them back together through this book. And through writing about them, But it was a very personal story, and I became, we're very close friends now, Janine. She's a wonderful, wonderful woman, and she kind of buried all this for 50 years. And for her, this was very therapeutic, telling the story. But it was very important to me that we tell it from Janine's point of view, and we give her mother Esther back her voice, because much of the story has been told over the decades. And it was told about Rena Castellani, the father, was this very charismatic man. He was a broadcaster at CKNW. He did the stunts. He did these incredible stunts. And he becomes this larger-than-life psychopath. And, I didn't want to shy away from that because that was a really interesting part. But I wanted also Janine and her mother to come forward. And I think that was successful in the book. And I just don't know how you would translate that into film. So a very long way of answering. I have nothing against it, and I really hope they do make my books into a fictional true crime event, but I probably won't enjoy them.
Wow. It sounds like you've had some really amazing interactions with people and opportunities to connect people with each other and for you to connect with people because of the work that you've been doing.
Well, that's true. Yeah, I've definitely met a lot of very, very interesting people.
Yeah.
And got to know a lot of, the deceased. I feel like, for instance, with Vance, I feel like I know him probably better than anybody because of all the work and getting to know him, through that research material that, turned up in the garage. Because even he had his private diary from 1934, and it was the year when there were 7 attacks on his life from criminals that are afraid to go up against him in court. And he'd actually had a bomb sent through, which is, now the police museum, but was, the coroner's court and the morgue back then. And it was actually sent through the police department to the morgue in the mail. Like, if he'd shaken it too hard, it probably would have taken out most of the building. It was incredible. He had this photo of it, right? He had homemade bombs, but he'd written all this in his diary about these attacks on his life. So I was able to use that, in his voice, which is just magical because, of course, I can't make, it's not like fiction. I can't make up what he's thinking or what he's saying. But I was reading it, and no one else had seen it because it was being locked up in a box for 70 years. And so that was truly incredible for me.
One thing that Sarah and I talked about in our earlier episode was that sometimes as a listener or a consumer of this, you can feel maybe a little guilty because you're being entertained by someone's, real life tragedy. But I love hearing this from you, Eve, to learn how much good comes out of, uncovering these stories and sharing them with the world. A lot of positive things have come from your work.
Well, we haven't solved anything. I mean, and that would be the greatest thing if we found a missing person, or if we solved a case through a tip. And because part of what I'm doing, and it's intentional, is the cases. The oldest case was 1993, so this was even 2 years before DNA came out on the scene. So, when we're looking at cases in the 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s even, a lot of the evidence wasn't treated very well. It was contaminated, it was lost, it was thrown out. So the DNA that could, solve these cases through genetic genealogy, for example, isn't going to happen because the DNA is just not there. The only way these cases are going to be solved is from a tip, deathbed confession or something. And the only way that's going to happen is if we keep talking about them. And one of the things I did after Cold Case Vancouver came out in 2015, and, again, I got to know a lot of the families, and it just didn't feel right to leave it there. Okay, I've told the story, it's in a book, so let's move on to something else. And it just didn't feel right. So I started up a Facebook page, Cold Case Vancouver, which morphed into a group page called Cold Case Canada, which is still going really strongly. It's got, I think, 8,000 members or something at the moment, and the page has about 23,000 followers. And it's very active. And on the day that someone was murdered or they went missing, I'll put up a post with their photo, and I'll put up, where to call if you have information. And I just really have connected with so many family and friends, and even law enforcement. Retired detectives will often get in contact with me about a case that, one of the ones that they couldn't let go that was never solved. And so, I've managed to sort of build up a lot of contacts through that. And a lot of those stories in Cold Case BC, my new book, came from that Facebook page, came from people that actually reached out to me. So that's been really rewarding as well. And hopefully, we have had some credible tips that, have passed along to the police. Now, whether anything's happened with that, I don't know, because, police won't talk about unsolved murders ever, even if they're decades old and no one's looked at them or blown the dust off them, in decades. And part of the problem with these really old cases, especially, in urban areas, rural areas, with RCMP detachments, is they haven't been digitised. So these cases are sitting in banker boxes in storage offices somewhere, and no one's taken them out to look at. The RCMP are changed over probably every 5 years or so. They're moved along somewhere else, and a new person comes to take over the file. And, barely do they get a chance to look at current cases, let alone dive into cold cases. And so it becomes really frustrating for the family, particularly because they can't get any information at all. And, we know that no one's working on them. So at least having them out there, having their story out there, hopefully makes people care and maybe prods, my, fantasy is it sort of prods police to take another look. And maybe there is DNA sitting in a box somewhere that they can test, but someone has to physically go look.
So you mentioned that you don't watch a lot of true crime, but you listen to a lot of true crime podcasts. How do you know that you're going to enjoy something when you start listening to it?
Well, first thing, if it's a couple of hosts and they start on with 5 minutes of chit-chat that has nothing to do with it, that's me out. I can't listen to that. And if the host is having fun, there's so many of these, let's have some laughs with our true crime, and I can't think of some of the more well-known ones, but, it's true crime comedy. I just don't understand that. It's just beyond my comprehension how you can have fun with someone's murder or someone's missing child. So that's the complete turn-off for me. I'm not going to listen to anything that, anyone that's not taking this seriously. I also want to know that they've done some original research and hopefully done some interviews, or at least connected with the family and friends to let them know what they're doing. And I don't believe most of these true crime podcasts do that. It just doesn't sound like they do at all. It doesn't sound like they connect with law enforcement in many of these cases. And while, unsolved, as I was just babbling on about, the police won't talk to you about unsolved murders, retired detectives will. So if you do a bit of, snooping around as I do, you will turn up retired detectives. And, if you're respectful and serious, they will talk to you. There are also a lot of, information that you can get. Now, it costs money to get inquests from old cases, but you can get phenomenal information that, is just not out there. I'm not interested if someone's just telling me a story that's been ripped off, newspaper database and, talking about wild speculation. I've heard some of my cases and I've stopped listening to other people doing them because it just drives me nuts because I think, I'm screaming at them, no, that didn't happen. That's not true. You can't make this up. If you're just making this stuff up, it's not what happened. And I guess the other thing with me, I'm not interested in the murderers. I have done some cold cases because I do find it interesting to follow the police investigation and just I think it gets a bit relentless when you don't hear any solved cases. It makes it sound like the police never solved anything, which is completely not true. And so I like doing some solved cases just to walk through the police investigation, because they will happily talk to me when they're solved. So I can get a lot of great information that way. And I think that's really interesting. You know, a case after 40 years was solved, say, through a Mr. Big sting, or it was solved through genetic genealogy, or it's solved through a tip. I think that's really fascinating. But I'm not interested in the murder, and even with these solved cases, I really play them down. So I don't listen to podcasts about serial killers and stuff like that. I can't listen to them, and I guess I'm just not interested in them. But I am interested in, you know, well done true crime podcasts that are really well researched. And in the end, though, I want them wrapped up in a really riveting story, a riveting true story. And I don't think that that's difficult. I think, you know, while I'm writing non-fiction or true crime, and I'm obviously not making anything up, I'm quite a purist in that way, I do try to use all the tools of fiction, you know, to bring colour into a story. You know, I talk about the place or setting. I try to give the story suspense. You know, in Murder by Milkshake, I want you turning the page like you would with a thriller. You know, that's my goal. And I want strong characters in them. But they're real people. But, you know, I do everything I can to develop, you know, their character, as I tried to do with the Castellanis through Janine and their friends and other people that knew them. And, you know, with Vance, with his own materials and again, with people that knew him.
Well, and I think as a occasional consumer of true crime, I think that focus on the characters and the setting, and you know, you tend to provide some context in terms of, you know, what was going on at the time, and yeah, I think I prefer that if that's what I'm going to be consuming.
Well, I'll have you completely converted over to true crime soon.
And so I think as a final question from me, Eve, who do you look for, if anybody, for inspiration in the genre?
I don't. You know, I've read books that I think are brilliant, like, you know, Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. I mean, that was kind of a groundbreaker for this genre. And it was a brilliant book, but it was also told, you know, from the murderer's point of view, which I don't love. And Joseph Wambaugh wrote a brilliant book, The Blooding, which was the first police investigation using DNA. There are other true crime writers like Ed Starkins wrote Who Killed Janet Smith, set in the 1920s in Vancouver. I think that's brilliant. Stevie Cameron wrote about the Pickton murders in detail, and she focused strongly on the victims and their families that were involved. So, you know, I thought she did a fantastic report. She's a terrific reporter as well, doing that. So I guess, you know, in that sense, I really admire their stuff. I don't think I really get, you know, draw my own inspiration. I think my inspiration comes from actually doing the research and talking to the family and friends and, you know, the law enforcement and all of that. That's what inspires me.
This has been so wonderful, Eve. I've just enjoyed hearing you talk about the behind the scenes of this so very much. I probably listen to more true crime than Sarah, but I don't. I'm certainly not an expert or consider myself, you know, a true crime junkie, so to speak. But I just admire what you do so much. I think this is just fascinating.
Oh, well, thank you so much. You know, I'm thrilled that you're interested.
No, it's been wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, Eve, this has been such a pleasure. And listeners, I hope you enjoyed this little treat.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed being on it. Thank you.
Brooke, that was such an amazing conversation with Eve.
Oh my goodness. I think I could talk to her all day long, Sarah. For any of you who want to learn more about Eve, please visit her website, evelazarus.com.
And she's also got a couple of places on Facebook that listeners can visit. So there's the Cold Case BC Facebook page, and Cold Case Canada Facebook group.
So thank you everyone for joining us today for this very special episode of Clued in Mystery. I'm Brooke.
And I'm Sarah, and we both love mystery. Clued in Mystery is produced by Brooke Peterson and Sarah M. Stephen. Music is by Shane Ivers at silvermansound.com. Visit us online at cluedinmystery.com or social media at Clued in Mystery. If you liked what you heard, please consider subscribing, leaving a review, or telling your friends.